Hello, I'm Revati Prasad, Executive Director of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about how digital inclusion organizations can and already do measure the impact of their work. At Benton, we think a lot about what it means to understand progress at scale. We know that mapping who has access is a challenge. We understand that measuring affordability across markets is complicated. When we get to digital inclusion programs, that task becomes even more complex. Here, we're not measuring miles of fiber or the dollar total on a broadband bill, but we're trying to measure skill, confidence, and its effect in the world. That's a tall order in and of itself, but we're also placing the responsibility of this task at the feet of practitioners who are already stretched thin. They have the least time and resources to design and execute rigorous evaluation on top of everything else that they do. So today is about making this work more doable, and I'm excited for the incredible panelists we've assembled for this conversation. I'm going to hand this off to our research director, Dr. Caroline Stratton, to introduce them and to guide our discussion today. Caroline?
Thanks, Revati. I'm Caroline Stratton, Research Director of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, and we're about to have this conversation about evaluating digital inclusion efforts that we hope will be highly practical and have some applicable lessons for our audience. For this event, I'm going to introduce our panelists and start a moderated discussion to give you a better idea about where their perspectives and experience with evaluation come from. So first, I would like to welcome Dr. Amy Gonzalez. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Communication and Associate Director of the Chicano Studies Institute at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the lead author of A Simple Evaluation Guide for the Digital Equity Community, published in 2024 by Digitunity. Also with us is Dr. Richard Feisman. He's Chief Learning and Evaluation Officer of Tech Goes Home. Tech Goes Home's 2023 publication of Theory of Change Research informed a 2024 10-year strategic plan for the organization and their associated evaluation efforts. Also with us is Meg Koifer, Chief Visionary Officer of the STEM Alliance, and she has led the STEM Alliance to conduct evaluation of multiple initiatives and programs, including things like the Yonkers Y-Zone Digital Equity Project and Connect Westchester. And I'm sorry to report that one of our planned panelists for this webinar, Dr. Yuan Kim, can't join us today. She's a Benton Opportunity Fund Fellow and co-author of the evaluation guide with Dr. Gonzalez. So welcome to you all. Thank you for being here today. And I want to start with a question that will questions that will get everybody acquainted somewhat with your organization and your experience with evaluation. So I'm going to start here by asking Meg to tell us about a specific evaluation that the STEM Alliance has done of a program, about the question it answered or the problem that it solved, and what you did with the final product.
Hi, thanks so much. So at the STEM Alliance, we've been building scaled digital navigator programs. So we want to be able to reach clients at scale. And one of the places that evaluation merged with some of our programmatic needs is that because we help with both the device ownership skills and helping people enroll in free or affordable internet, we wanted to create efficiencies so that we weren't just offering a one-size-fits-all to every client. But in order to do that, we needed to know what a client's needs are. Do they need help with owning a computer? Do they need help with skills? Do they need help with internet, or some combination? And this became both an evaluation tool that helped inform fiscal and programmatic efficiencies, as well as reporting, being able to report and describe the problem of digital equity and inclusion. Because a lot of the census data happens at a household level, but the experience of digital exclusion is actually happening at an individual level. So if you have 3 people living in a home and no device, then you have 3 people who are experiencing it, not a household. So long and short, we developed a digital needs screener that had very pointed questions in each category. And we developed a really simple algorithm. I'm talking, like, you use the word algorithm, it's really just a small algebra equation to take the answers to that the people gave to that question and convert it into a score on a scale of 1 to 5 as to whether or not they had low need in each of the areas or high need. And the problem that solved was the efficiency of our digital navigators being able to help them with exactly what they needed. It improved how we how we use our funds to serve them. So we're not helping them with things they didn't need help with. And then last and most importantly, we now have 6,000 digital needs screeners, which is probably one of the largest data sets in the state of New York for describing the digital divide.
Thank you so much. Rich, you're up next with this one. Tell us about a specific evaluation and a question it answered or a problem that it solved.
No, excited to talk about it. So Tech Goes Home actually has a 25-year history in the field. So we've been actually doing this for a long time. And for much of that, there's been a lot of evaluation data collected. And so one of the things that we are particularly interested in is who are we serving and how has that actually changed over time? And so most recently when we came in, we did a really good job of trying to collect all that data because we knew we had somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 responses. And so one of the things we did this year was actually clean that up. And what we were able to see is between 2017 and 2025, how many learners do we have? Who are they? How have those changed over time? And that's actually just a great starting point because we can actually then say who we're serving, where are they at, and actually get at those real details. So it's not just kind of the individual programs because we're usually working with 200 organizations a year when we're doing this. And so what we're most excited about now is then being able to then say, okay, now we can actually talk program effectiveness. Who is it working the best for? Where can we tweak it here? Where can we do it there? And so this first report will probably come out in the next couple months. And then what we're hoping to do is several follow-up reports to actually talk about scale of intervention and who it's working best with.
Thank you so much. We've got some folks with real data under their belts here, is what's clear. Amy, I'm going to turn to you next. So in the evaluation guide that you've made for nonprofits, and part of this was that you conducted a study with colleagues about evaluation needs and practices, informing what's in your guide. Could you talk a little bit about what you found as organizations' motivations for conducting evaluations and what, if anything, surprised you about how nonprofits were thinking about and working with data?
Sure. I mean, to start with the second question, in some ways, I was surprised how often folks really were working with data in many instances. Many organizations, as we've just heard, are really immersed in it. Often smaller organizations, even if they wanted to, maybe didn't have the resources, usually with the staff resources, with the skills to do that kind of work, or just the time. But to go back to your first question, I mean, we could kind of capture, I think, a lot of the motivations into kind of, or put them into at least three big buckets. One of the most common reasons is for getting grants, right? Increasingly, and there's some research on this, that just grants over the last few decades increasingly require evaluation. And even when they don't, we had interviewees, and these were all nonprofit directors, staff, saying things like, I just kept applying for the grant, and it wasn't until I put some data in there, right, that I got it, and I realized how important it is. So data, either asking for evaluation, but data to demonstrate effectiveness, vision, et cetera, I think is really essential for getting grants, attracting donors, also just improving your own programming, right? As Rich points to, making sure that if your decision-making within your organization is based on data whenever possible. Organizations really talked about that. And that doesn't always have to be surveys, right? Lots of times that data is qualitative interviews with clients, but also with staff to get a sense of how are things working? How is the delivery experience for both sides of that equation? And then finally, and I think this was really important, but not always kind of so top of mind, was just the use of data to network across community organizations, sharing, kind of encapsulating what an organization does and how effectively they do it as a way to promote what they can offer to partner organizations. Because, as those in the nonprofit space know much better than I, that you're always working on less funds than you'd like, and sharing resources, referring out to the organization that is better equipped to do X, Y, or Z requires also sharing an understanding of those, what each can bring to that community table. So those were kind of the three primary motivations that we saw.
Great, thank you so much. In one of those where you're talking about grant funding, you get us to, we've talked about this as a group together before, a chicken and egg problem when it comes to evaluation. So having an evaluation of your programs that says they're effective, this is great evidence to use to get more resources. And as we'll talk about too, that might be part of the funding for a particular program. But what about when you don't have an evaluation yet, or you don't have that kind of evidence yet? Rich, I'm going to turn this to you.
So a lot of times the way I want to think about evaluation is it needs to be useful. And even if you have no evaluation team and you haven't done anything, it needs to be something that's practical. I started out as a middle school teacher in New York. And when people said they were coming to evaluate me, I was like, okay, this is something we just got to get through, because I didn't get the data afterwards and I couldn't use it properly. And so one of the key elements we find, especially when working with instructors, is it's really important to get data back to them. And it can be really simple. I love what you mentioned earlier. It can be focus groups. It can be just an interview. It can be anything. But the important piece is to not let credentials or thinking you have to think too many things through first. It's just, how is this useful to your program? And what can you gather that can just make the program useful and better in the future? And then you can start adding sophistication later.
So on that point of starting somewhere, I've got this question for Meg around, so evaluation might look challenging to organizations because you might say, I don't have in-house expertise, or I don't have capacity, or I have very little. So some organizations might stop right there. Others might go forth anyway with existing tools and resources. And then we know at the sort of highest end, you've hired an external expert to come in, design things, help you collect data, go through all of that. So along that kind of continuum between making do with what you have and hiring expertise, what kinds of advice do you have about how to proceed for organizations with differing resources?
I love this question because I really want to say that data was pivotal to our growth as an organization. We started as a small nonprofit led by volunteers and evolved. And even just in the past 5 years, our digital equity budget has grown significantly, and therefore our delivery. But data was pivotal to that growth because at one point we had a potential funder 5 years ago that was going to take a chance on us. We didn't have a ton of experience in this field yet, even though we had other success in other ways in different types of work. And so they said, we're going to bring you on and we're going to give you a large scale multi-year grant, but you have to take our researcher with you and you have to build it into your grant budget. This changed things for us dramatically for two reasons. One, woe is me, like, I'll take your grant, I'll take your researcher. Like, this was the highest quality problem I had ever had, was being told we have a little bit of not distrust, but we need to see where the work is being measured. And we have somebody we trust, so we want you to take that person. And the reason I say that is because that funder made me realize that I should be writing a research consultant into every grant unapologetically. And it never occurred to me before that. I was always like, drive costs down, drive costs down. But I think that funders are asking more and more for evaluation, and that if you are unapologetic and transparent about that cost and why you have that cost, you can do more. And it completely evolved what we did, because then we wrote, based on what we were learning in this one grant, that's where we wrote a grant for our entire data platform. So then we went out for a pure capacity grant to manage all of our clients and collect data. So we have that digital needs screener. We have the services we provided. Those are kind of, those are more output oriented. Now we also have a 3 to 6 month impact metric, all contained in one platform. So that experience led us to then being bold enough to get a grant just for the data. There was one other thing that happened alongside, which was partnering with universities. So we had another grant where we had a much smaller opportunity, but we were able to partner with universities. So whether you are functioning off of internal spreadsheets or are able to secure grant funding by building it into your grant or actually doing it as a capacity grant, we have really learned you can't You can't not do it. You must be engaged with data. And there are really staged ways to do it that are exhilarating, informative, and they improve both your best practices and your ability to tell your story.
Thank you so much. The fact that you described these the data collection as exhilarating too for organizations is is why we are here today, and I hope why viewers are with us. So to that you just mentioned, that we might be evaluating programs for multiple purposes, or an evaluation might give us fuel for several things at once within the organization. I want to talk about that for a bit. So you might be required to do an evaluation for a funder. You might undertake this voluntarily to understand and improve effectiveness of programs. You might want to be doing, like what Amy was talking about, you might want to show results to other service providers and community partners. You might want to show results to your program participants too. And so the kinds of questions you ask and the results that you get could feel like they're for an internal audience. They could feel like they're for an external audience. They could feel like they're for the program participants themselves. So I want to talk about evaluation that might serve multiple purposes and multiple audiences within a single project. And I especially want to think about what should people consider before they attempt to do multi-purpose sort of evaluation. And I'm going to put this question to Rich first.
The thing I would always start with is, what do you actually want to get out of it as your priority? Like, what is the mission of your org? What are you trying to do with your program? And then kind of build around from there. And because there's an infinite amount of tools, there's all sorts of different ways you can go about this. But many times the same data can be used for lots of different purposes. And so it's really important to have just a really clear, simple question that you're trying to answer. And once you're doing that, you can build that with really simple starting methods. Like, a lot of times it starts with impact. When you're working with real world data like we are, and you're out in the field, people want to know, is your program doing anything? And so if you just start with a case study, if you just start with a conversation about what do you think your program does and what does this other person see it coming about from their experience with it, you can get a lot out of that. And that same type of impact you can then use for all sorts of different types of evaluation afterwards. And so it's always trying to get that really key, what are you actually trying to do? And then thin it down, because no one ever says, wow, this survey is too short. Like, everyone, they don't want to see like these really long things. So no matter what, I've seen 3-minute surveys and 30-minute surveys get complained about. So really get at your impact and really try to see what you want to get out of it, and then kind of go from there.
Amy, I'm going to turn this multiple audiences, multiple purposes thing to you. What should organizations consider?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Rich is saying. I think always start with, throwing in the kitchen sink and then call back, because you're right, real estate on any sort of data collection context is always expensive. People, rule of thumb often is about 10 minutes and they're out. That's on a good day, right? So, I mean, but in some ways I have the same answer as Rich, which is just wanting to have as much foresight in there as possible to try to cast a wide net in your goals. I mean, I can shamelessly promote the evaluation guide that I created because part of a primary purpose of that was to give basically what we do at the back end after collecting the data and getting insights from practitioners is then kind of consolidating that with expertise teaching an intro research methods class to say, how do we create what we call kind of the 5 W's of research? And so kind of giving questions, prompts to your organization, your staff, asking as a team, kind of the who, what, when, where, why. And we have kind of sub questions within those about, who am I trying to learn from? What claim am I trying to support, et cetera. So ultimately, there's just a list of about 12, 15-ish questions. But I think asking those before you begin the research, so you really know what your aims are, and really literally writing things down. I know that sounds simple and mundane, but I think sometimes forcing ourselves to be really concrete with what our goals are brings up for ourselves new questions or new problems that we might see in advance that we wouldn't have if we hadn't forced that kind of concrete articulation of goals. So yeah, again, I could have just said kind of +1 to what Rich said, and you might want to check out the report to help guide that process. But, you know, bringing multiple stakeholders in at the beginning can also be helpful, right? So if you're talking to partners or clients and staff, or, you know, basically getting as many perspectives early on can help then increase the chances that the data you collect can check off multiple boxes when it comes to serving these various needs.
And I want to mention too, in the webinar announcement on the Benton site, you'll find a link to that simple guide to evaluation. And it is when you get towards the back is when you'll start to find practical kind of sets of things that look more like worksheets and such that you could fill in. All right, I'm going to turn to some practicalities. And Meg, I would love to hear from you about data that your organization collects. We've heard about the screener a little bit, but what else about programs? What's happening in programs? What kind of data are you collecting from participants, and why are those important? And I'm also curious within this, are there data that you intentionally do not collect or that you have stopped collecting over time?
Okay, so big picture for our digital inclusion work, we collect what we call a digital needs screener and a basic demographic intake. Those are two separate components. So it actually starts with the intake, and then they proceed to a digital needs screener. And the intake is primarily demographic. And then if they take a class with us, they do a before and after in that class. We have a very captive audience. We can do additional data collection there. If they just get a device or just get internet assistance, we won't have that. So again, you're now looking at subsets of data, right, that you have different data points on. And then anyone who gets our services has a simple satisfaction survey immediately upon conclusion of services. And then we have what we call an impact metric, which is typically 3 to 6 months out. We now have such a large data set that we're considering building like an 18 to 24 months out. That's just to give you examples of the instruments that we deploy. Now, this other question of what's on those and what do we choose to collect and why, or what have we stopped collecting? So one of the things that we need to raise here are these moral and ethical questions around data as well. We haven't even touched on the topic of opt-outs and things like that. There are some privacy considerations. This is not to scare anyone, right? Like we need to be aware of it, right? Are we allowed to share this data with another party that we're working with? So we do have that opt-out. Anybody can opt out of their data being shared at any deeper level than aggregated, than being just for statistical analysis. But the real issue here is that being poor is expensive, or being vulnerable is expensive. And one of the ways that shows up is that you have to answer a lot of questions in surveys. And so we at the STEM Alliance really take that responsibility seriously. And one of the aspects that we think about is what I think Amy was saying, which is, do we need to collect this? Like, if I want a computer, I walk into Best Buy and I buy it. I don't have to answer any questions. And so we always hold that when we're developing our instruments. An example is that we therefore, we're not collecting gender. We're like, we don't need to collect that. What is that? We're not going to report on that. That's not important. Well, then we developed a relationship. The word partner was spoken about. When you have partner relationships, we were working very intimately with the Westchester Women's Agenda. And all of a sudden we realized we don't know if there's a gender divide in the digital divide. And then we did some research, and there really wasn't a lot of studies on that, at least in our country. Globally, there's some studies on it. So we're like, wow, maybe we should be asking gender. So that's an example where we weren't asking and we added it. Now, it turns out that well over 2/3 of the people who are requesting our services do identify as female. Now, these are people who are coming forward. It's different than being in the digital divide. Those are the ones who are asking for help. But still, it actually turned out it was important. And that has informed some of our programmatic development. Additionally, so that's one example of how we've evolved our instrument. I think another example that's been a harder nut to crack is that as we look at funding, we have to understand what sectors outside of digital inclusion practitioners are going to partner with us and care about people having digital access. And one of those is workforce. Well, workforce evaluations are, did the person earn another dollar? And this became a very challenging metric for us for two reasons. One, our work is more of a slow churn. If you're working with someone who's never used a device before and you're just getting them to become a tech adopter, you may not see a change in their hourly wage premium in 6 months, 8 months, even 18 months. But the workforce sector really cares about how much more they made per hour. And then but the second challenge with that is this idea that even if they made more money inside X period of time, can you grab that correlation? Can you prove that that's because they did a digital equity class? So what we had to do was really work with some data experts in workforce to understand what were legitimate ways to describe the change that we were having that we could fairly claim versus something that could be influenced by other factors. And the way that we got down to that was describing the increase in wage premium value. Whether or not they earned another dollar, we improved their ability to earn another dollar. And that actually was a different data set. It's Indeed. If it says it needs digital skills, could they get more money? So sorry for those long stories, but this is how, again, kind of exhilarating it can be, but you have to have a lot of conversations.
Absolutely. You also get at things across different types of stakeholders and what their data practices might be, what their expectations might be there too. Something came up in your answer too that I'm going to probe with Rich around the ethics of data collection. So when we think about all the things that might stop an organization from starting on a research project or starting on some evaluation research, it could be like, oh no, I don't know enough about the ethics of data collection to really go forward. Rich, what do you have for people in this situation?
So when you start thinking about internal program improvement, all that stuff is actually on the table right from the beginning when you want to think about ethical data collection. So when you're looking at how to do internal program improvement that you're not going to talk about the data publicly, pretty much everything's on the table. But when you start collecting information that's really important to people, and you realize that you're going to start to have to hold some things confidential, like when you have combinations of race, gender, telephone numbers, addresses. These are things that we have to start being a little bit more careful about. And so there are lots of trainings out there. You can use your institutional review boards at your local universities. This is why partnering with a university can become very useful, because then they can connect you to that. I myself, when I come into programs, one of the first things we do is we actually get IRB certified. And I pay for independent IRBs to do that. But when you're a program that's just starting, you don't want to be afraid of the data, especially for program improvement. You just want to always keep an eye out for when you're working with vulnerable populations, when you're working with children, when you're working with incarcerated individuals, when you're working with employees, people that kind of don't have as much of a choice. It's all about having that opt-out, and it's all about making sure that this is a voluntary commitment of information in a trade, and that your job as the researcher is to keep it confidential. We try to avoid the word anonymous because in our world, it's nearly impossible to have anonymize the data. You keep thinking it is, but if you have these small samples and just enough personal information, it's not going to be anonymous. But it's kind of, that's where you get at it. It comes to the ethics of controlling and using that data properly, especially the difference between internal usage and external usage, and not being afraid of going externally to get that support through university partnerships, or just if you get larger on your own, making sure you get, because most of the time you're going to get what's called an IRB waiver, because we're not actually doing stuff that's very intensive or dangerous. But it's still, you have to be able to make that information in a controlled setting.
Thanks for thinking about that with us. Rich, I'm going to put you on the spot again. So with the experience that you gained in evaluation in the education sector, when you look at digital inclusion work, where do you see opportunities or low-hanging fruit, basically, for organizations to start putting in place the kinds of things that education organizations have long been collecting?
My first statement is the lowest hanging fruit is always like a story about impact from an individual. And there's lots of very valuable pieces, because what happens is when you use mixed methods, which is basically taking quantitative big surveys and combining them with these stories. If you're just starting out, just getting a story of impact will teach you about your program. Every time I've gone out and worked with a group, and let's say it's like our senior center programs, we learn how they use our program in ways that we didn't even think about, and that helps us develop our instruments down the line. So even just getting one or two stories about how impact your program was, how impactful your program was on somebody is a big deal, because then it can move to all sorts of other areas. And then you can just grow it from there. You can develop your surveys from those stories. You can just use those stories as long as you get your permission structure in place. But you can use those stories to talk to your local politicians. You can use those stories to talk to your staff and use those stories to develop a deeper evaluation.
So I want to bring this up because in the nonprofit world, talking about data and stories is, we've all heard this phrase umpteen times. And it's interesting too, as a person who loves qualitative research, to think about qualitative data as stories. So why do we differentiate between the two? Can we find peace and harmony? Are there important differences? Amy or Meg, I'm going to let either of you chime in.
Amy, you want to take that first?
No, I think in some ways the impact of those distinctions, you're probably more, you have your finger on the pulse of the implications for practitioners better than I. So why don't you give your insights, and then if I have any ideas.
I would say a couple of things. Right now we're in county budget advocacy season, and I find our statistical data to be phenomenal. Like when I can walk into a room and say, out of 6,000 people, 92% of them don't own a computer, and 56% of them have no computer in the home at all. I can't believe people aren't falling on the ground saying, what do you need? But they aren't. When I walk in and say, and tell a story, a true story, that in September we had a mother of 6 children where she and her son were going to get their bachelor's for the first time together, and they don't have a computer. And that because of your funding, I was able to fix that within 48 hours. Everybody gets it. So the qualitative is incredibly important. And I think that especially because our work is what I call proactive, not reactive. I mean, that story makes it look reactive, like that was a desperate person and we fixed it. And so sometimes it can be reacting to an urgent need in front of us, but which is often where empathy is built. And so even though where I think the power of our work is the proactive movement of people into self-empowerment and financial independence, or ending social isolation for elder populations, even though that is what moves me, the reactive of there's someone with an immediate need and we fixed it, that is what people overwhelmingly respond to. And you see it because our food pantries are doubling in size and funding, and digital inclusion work is shriveling. And so we have to be able to tell passionate stories of urgent, immediate need. And for many, many people, emotions are more touched by stories.
I guess I would weigh in only to say that I would agree with all of that, especially probably when you're talking, I imagine, to funders or local partners. I do think that especially before and after data that where you can show with a brief statistic, number of people served, improved literacy rates quickly, and in a line or two, I think is a nice complement to, but especially powerful in grant applications. I think that's a context where you're especially going to want numbers when possible. It's partly easier to convey that data. Usually the people reviewing grants are kind of used to seeing that kind of data as well. So yeah, just another 2 cents there, but I agree with all
I do want to jump in on that, Amy, because I think you also raised something, and Rich, I could imagine you feel this as well, which is that quantitative data has a story. And so part of it is also our storytelling of the quantitative data, like not to get a little too meta here, but it's kind of all interwoven.
Yeah.
And to that, and you really brought that up for me, Amy, because now that our data sets are large enough, we were able to do a split analysis of people taking a Spanish-speaking class versus an English-speaking class. And this became a story because it turns out that the Spanish-speaking participants started with significantly lower confidence, took the same 15-hour curriculum, and ended with similar levels of confidence to their English-speaking peers, which tells that this is an opportunity gap, not a skills gap. Exactly.
I love
And that becomes a story about a population of people that if we tell the story correctly, it's data, but it can become a story.
Totally.
And so if you're a storyteller, know that data will not take that away from you. You can learn how to wed those two things.
Yeah, that 1-2 punch of that factoid with here's a short excerpt from a quote from someone from that Spanish speaker class, right? Like Spanish speaking class, that's like such a great package.
One tidbit I wanted to throw in when we kind of move from the low-hanging fruit to the more complicated pieces is doing a single case story and telling that story, low-hanging fruit. The second you have 1,000 stories and actually have to analyze those, that's actually going to be way more difficult than 1,000 quantitative data points. And so as you're thinking about this, scaling qualitative research is actually very difficult and timely and time-consuming. And so there is a difference between, I don't want anybody thinking I said, oh, just gather a bunch of stories, it's going to be great. That's actually very difficult work. But getting a couple stories of high impact, that one is a little quicker.
And Rich, I'm going to have to jump in again because it's the responsibility of the data and why it matters also has to be shared by the team. Because I was finding out like after the fact some of these incredible stories, and I was like, and they were like, oh no, that guy, I served him like 18 months ago. I don't know if I can get him back in. And I was like, oh my gosh. There was like an artist who literally opened up an entire online website and was selling his work, and he had never successfully sold before. But like nobody thought that we would want to know that story at a more global level. So it's also, and I think you said this, Amy and Rich, is bringing everyone into that collection mindset with you. And then also, we usually once a year kind of geek out in a staff meeting on all of our data. And because otherwise we forget to talk about it internally. And so that's a kind of another thing too, is really making this something that we can all share and collaborate on together, even if it's not a direct piece of our role. I can tell you that our operations manager has given us great insight into some of our data that we didn't have the right mindset for.
That's awesome. Love it when we get to respond to each other here in this space. I want to turn to talk about something that is sort of back burner for the moment, but Amy, I want to talk with you about collective impact. So a lot of folks in the digital inclusion space, whether they were in government organizations, they were going to apply for sub-grant competitions of state capacity grants and digital equity, or they were teaming up with others around competitive grants, there was about to be some impetus for assessing collective impact. And while that policy kind of carrot and stick is gone now, I know that there's some interest in the field around how we aggregate impact across multiple types of organizations, or how do we get to cumulative impact? This may be true in coalitions. I'm also thinking about NDIA's aggregator tool that came out a few months ago. Where are there opportunities to understand this, and how, when, why, how, what would you tell people about thinking about collective impact now?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had all the knowledge about where everyone could go to find such coalitions. If I did, I would use that information for good, but I don't have that, secret recipe across the country. But I will say that, I'm sure just as well, if not better than I, Carolyn, in so many ways, that I think all of the energy that went into all of these state broadband plans means that I know I can speak within California at least, right? Lots of forward movement that had already taken place. And I'd like to think that we can't put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to kind of the initiation of many of these coalitions. I know we have a robust Tri-County Coalition here that certainly was kind of saw growth post-COVID in part due to what everyone thought was going to be a bunch of IIJA funding. But I think, the goal is then how do we do more with less, right? It doesn't mean the goals stop just because the funding's not there in the same way. So I think practitioners have those in the room listening probably have a better sense than I about how to find the resources to do that, which is obviously a very tricky problem. But I can say that I think at least what I've seen here locally be really effective is a few different things. So if the question is really like, how do we find the data that represents multiple stakeholders, multiple regions even, there's a few different options still. One are, census data that's been collected and is still public, both at NTIA on their website and the American Community Surveys at the census, both census data that are collected regularly and usually at the county level. So for example, our region has sometimes relied on that county level data to at least demonstrate trends and then compare that. Because one thing that's nice about those data is a lot of those questions not a lot, many of them have been collected, every time that data is collected. So you can see change over time, right? What is the growth of internet access in our region and where is it still not available? What is the growth in computer ownership and how does this vary by employment status or age? So those can be useful tools and of course are tools that multiple stakeholders within a region are going to care about. But then I think trying to turn to those collectives that have been built, and then I think the blessing and the curse of digital equity, right, is that we can no longer do our jobs or get access to healthcare or engage in education without access to technology. But the benefit of that is that means folks in this room have a lot of invested stakeholders that want to be in conversation with them. So I think whether those coalitions have been built or not, reaching out to your local community healthcare clinic and asking them what their funding is, because it might be a little bit better than a nonprofit that's just giving out computers, but they sure as hell might be interested in partnering with that organization because they might have the skills to train their nursing staff or their support staff on the tech process that now, low-income healthcare clients certainly need to get access to their, online health profile, or et cetera. I know we have a local equity coalition that has housing, it has family services, it has local education institutions, and all of them are doing tech support, and some of them are a little better funded than, digital equity nonprofits alone. So I think a lot of times sharing maybe data collection and data collection resources across these organizations can be useful. I've seen that happen here locally, and as a way to try to fill in some of these gaps. Don't leave out libraries, of course. And of course, I'm sure practitioners, I'll pause in a second to say, let others weigh in. There are also challenges with that, right? Sharing resources across an array of local nonprofits can get tricky for lots of reasons. But sometimes there's opportunities where everybody's winning and there's lots of back scratching. If we can say, how do we all help support this data collection initiative, make sure there's a few questions for each of this, and then share those data. So I think those are a few ideas. Hopefully that kind of addresses maybe what you're getting at, Carolyn.
Meg or Richard, thoughts on this challenging?
The first thing that comes to my mind is one of the big keys is really needing a strong intermediary that kind of like works between them, because that's the whole core problem. Is we get asked, let me give you a good example of this, is we get asked all the time if people can use our data. And our starting part is almost always no, because it's our job and our responsibility to not share that data because people gave it to us with a specific purpose. However, if you have a strong intermediary that can create the data agreements and get these pieces, you can really get beyond some of the basic spots and getting to actually effectiveness and other things and growth and these types of pieces that we want to get at. My only other tidbit is if we're trying to get at aggregate data, like don't write all your items on your own again. Like there's lots and lots of items out there. There's lots of people. So talk to the researchers out in the field, and they will most likely just give you all the survey metrics you need. As we just said, there's a report that has a ton of them right now. So it's really important to use that, so that way we can actually show this type of aggregate data collection eventually, rather than just having a bunch of items that don't line up very well.
Yeah, thank you for that. This reminds me to go to our YouTube questions, because I think we got something to that of that nature. That we had a question from YouTube of, are there examples of multiple organizations sharing client data or centralizing data collection to kind of remove burden? And there's also within there a question about, are there reasons that this is a good or bad idea? So sort of data exchanges in this space. Have you seen anything?
I can honestly say that we have not had significant data exchanges per se. We do keep a data dashboard, a public-facing data dashboard of our aggregate data, of kind of our impact metrics, if you will. But we have not had an organization specifically ask for our data. We had a funder that, because of where we were like a vendor on their grant. And so we had to really, to Rich's point, we had to have a very, very clarified data sharing arrangement in advance. And we used a pro bono lawyer to help out with that, to make sure that we got it right. Again, I don't want that to sound intimidating. It's not that hard. It's just a ladder and you walk up it, but at the end of the day, I can honestly say we have not yet had a big cross aggregation of data in the area of digital inclusion. I will say that we have worked with another entity on another work stream of ours in the STEM education sector, where there's an organization that has an evaluation tool. We've purchased their evaluation tool, and we are therefore part of a national benchmark set. And that was a great solution for that work. And so is it conceivable that, an organization like Benton will develop that in the future? Yes. And we would absolutely engage and look at an opportunity like that if it became available. We're not opposed to it. It just hasn't really presented itself.
Yeah. Rich, this is inevitably making me think of education data and transmission across different types of organizations. Any advice you'd offer here?
Well, even in education data, it's such a problem. Like it is an issue. There are certain pieces that people can agree on, but then it's all the metrics are being assessed in different ways. And so it's organizations that become data heavy can be quite good independently, but you really do need a strong intermediary that has something like Meg's example was a great one, right? You have a group, you have these STEM organizations that do all sorts of assessments that you can share. But what happens is even when orgs like mine, let's say we did go into an agreement with a group, there'd be all sorts of data cleaning that takes time and time and time. And so this is something that needs to be done at the collective level. There needs to be because what happens is we're all kind of grinding on our own pieces, and we're just going to be motivated in that way. And until there's an intermediary that has this overall interest, whether it's in STEM or digital equity, it's real. I've seen these linger many times. If you even look at hospital systems trying to share their data, they have the hardest time doing this too. Yeah. So I'm not saying it's not going to happen. It's just, you just need somebody who has the time and space that focus just on that.
And Rich, I think what you're admitting too is because we've all been grinding right in our own wheelhouses for a minute, now because I have an entire CRM, I'd be pretty hard pressed to have to rewrite that whole CRM, right? And my workflow. Not saying I wouldn't do it. And there could be really good motivators and reasons. I'll give you one really concrete example. In New York State, although it is not yet rolled out exactly what that's going to look like, there's been some whisperings actual statements that United Way may be operationalizing a 311 call-in related to digital equity and inclusion services. Well, if we want to be a part of that, we may have to reconsider our intake. So, it's both being unapologetic about what you do and why you do it and proud of your systems, and then listening and seeing what else is going on in the ecosystem. And so I certainly would never want to have a fixed mindset, even though I'm incredibly proud of what we're doing already and think we've got very robust systems.
Just to add on to that, I totally agree, because we are very unlikely to change our back-end systems. But what we do when we do data agreements and sharing is we then have to download it, clean it up for the submission, and then resubmit, right? And that takes a certain level of skill that a lot of organizations don't have. And so it takes a lot of time. And so you really hit on a really good point there.
I just wanted to jump in to say I second the Rich's point about having a convener. And also to be clear, I think the data sharing, although possible, as they're saying, it is a ladder, is very difficult. I think what I was speaking to more was the data that has not yet been collected, right? Because so often what we're doing is trying to find new opportunities to collect data, especially with non-users. How do we find people that are not actually our clients so that we can get them to be our clients? And those points at which we're trying to find new forms of data can be a good place to try to reach out to partners in advance so that you've got multiple stakeholders in the game before the data has been collected. Also difficult, but not as difficult as sharing as convening after the data has all been collected.
It's also clear that this is a space where other sectors have a lot of lessons for us too. Potentially, I hadn't thought about that healthcare piece too. We had a question about survey response rates. If anybody wants to feel strongly about overall just trends of declining survey response rates, any sort of
yeah, I want to comment on this one right away. We don't have low survey response rates because our work is incredibly relationship based, and so a couple very, very clear strategies. Our digital navigators, for example, if they're in a class with the individuals, they literally tell them, you're going to be hearing from me in 3 to 6 months, and we want to be able to keep this programming going, and we really need to know how this is working out for you, and we might have other opportunities. So one of the things we do is we personalize that request. Hi, this is Alex. You and I, worked on this class where you learned these skills, and I told you I was going to get back to you. Here I am. We actually, in our digital skills class, we have them put a calendar reminder, because we teach them Google Calendar. We have them put a calendar reminder in. Did you hear from Alex? He's going to be reaching out to you about our survey. So we do this all and so we have extremely high response rates. We're over 25%, 3 to 6 months after services. So we're really proud of that, and it's all relationship based.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, survey response rates are a lot about how you deliver the program. And so there's a lot about how well you're integrating that data and making it useful is also a key one. Like our pre-survey it's nearly everybody. We do about 6,000 learners a year. Where it starts tailing off is towards the later in the program, right? That's how it goes. And when if we have somebody call in the language of the household, we can get great survey response rate. We do that for our annual survey. But if we just do an email blast, you're going to get in those 10s and 20s, right? And so it's always having like multiple different pieces, and it's not just, we are lucky enough that we're able to use incentives for our surveys, but that's not the solution. It doesn't always do it. So because our populations move around, an email address dies after a year if you don't catch up on it. So there's lots of other things that kind of pop in there, but it really is about making the data useful to get those like later tier surveys data, and then integrating it into your system to make sure it works out.
That's really great advice. We also got a question in here that I am going to field a little bit. So we had a question about data and reports that show aggregate impact or value of these services like device and internet access and improved tech skills. And the question includes that these impacts might be pretty similar location to location. So what I wanted to mention is this, I think maybe this week or last week, we had a post from Benton Senior Fellow John Horrigan about the Connect Westchester program with the STEM Alliance, in which he uses sort of an impact measurement from a previous study that he had done. So I think a study of Comcast Internet Essentials, actually, where he found like a certain increase in how participants, I'm going to forget, it's in a self-rated well-being, essentially. And he said, all right, based on what we know about that, I'm going to apply it over here to Connect Westchester and say, this is about more or less what I'd expect to see. So to this, they very much exist. And I think John Horrigan's work is one of the places kind of where I'd go to that sort of creative, where is there something I found at some point that I'm going to bring back in? I believe Digitunity has some recent work on, Amy, this might be your work, which I'm really, I should know this, about large screen devices or device format, and that's in the specific benefits there. But we're getting more of these we're getting more and more, I would say, of these reports where we've said, here's a benefit we're seeing, and we can estimate that, if we use this estimate and say these things are reasonably similar, here's what we expect to get.
Mhm.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was report, but we talk about it too. And also what I often do is when I'm trying to make sure I get rigorous, valid measures of use, I turn to those surveys like that the census is already asking and use their questions, because they have questions that say things like, am I using the internet to look for jobs? Am I using the internet to look for healthcare? And so then I can say, I borrow these same census questions and see how they play out in, a local survey. And then at the end of my report, which is the evaluation report that we talk about, that we have on Digitunity, we actually also include a handful of these questions that people might find useful, that I've historically found useful in my research when I'm trying to do that thing where I want to show a relationship between, a correlation between access and outcomes. And we also in the report talk through some really basic even statistics to try to do those things, because sometimes even the stats aren't that complicated. We're doing them in our intro methods class sometimes, and I think that sometimes the numbers freak people out, but just being able to show there's a relationship between whether or not people have a computer in the home and whether or not they were using the internet for healthcare outcomes is a really powerful data point, and sometimes not that hard to get. So we have questions about skills and well-being that people might find useful as well at the end of that report.
This also sort of rings a bell with what Meg was talking about earlier around earning potential or wage premium potential for increase. Sometimes we can't say, oh, we went back and found exactly, this particular impact. We can frame it as potential, or this is what we would expect out of this, that this opportunity opened up here. There's been a lot of creative thinking, I think, in that way.
Yeah. And I would say this is a great example, right? Like, I'm not a statistician. Like, hearing Amy speak is like very opening to me, and I want to own her language. But that's not my job, right? Like, I need to be doing the work I need to be doing. And so this is, for many people, this can feel both overwhelming, but it can also be a great leap of faith when you can come alongside a researcher like Amy, or in our case, John. And then most recently, the county that we've done a significant amount of our work with employed another researcher, Camoin Associates, and literally just this week, we are publishing a study that showed a $4.16 cost benefit for every dollar invested. So basically $4.5 million for the county in economic return. That's huge. But I'm not the researcher, right? And so I can tell you, again, going back to that storytelling, I can tell the story of where that was derived from. But if I'm going to enter places and spaces, I might want that researcher with me to explain the statistical analysis. But what the drivers were are actually, I think, what the person who posed the question is pointing to. The drivers are pretty global. They're pretty ubiquitous, right? It's telehealth. It's not missing work. It's spending, cost savings on spending, because you can use the internet to save money for your household. And it is the correlated research about basic your life improvement, your sense of life improvements, and how that has a correlated impact on income earning. And so those things in combination, this particular researcher really was able to make what they find to be statistically valid and bold statements that this has a massive cost benefit effect, that the return on investment is a 1 to 4 return on investment.
Well, that will be very exciting when it comes out. And I imagine that that's something that headlines, a plug for our daily newsletter. When we see things like this, we're eager to share them. Because we are so close to 3 p.m. Eastern, and I have, we have gone in a variety of directions, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give their 1 to 2 sentence lightning round piece of advice for folks about evaluation. Rich, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. My piece of advice is, don't be the person overly worried about reliability and validity when you're just getting started. Like, the data you have is probably the best data you have until you get something better, but you need to start somewhere. So there's always that person in the room that tries to question it. It's more, this is what we have, then work on the next step.
Meg, your final word here.
I think my final word is don't be overwhelmed by it. Outputs are different than outcomes. They are both worth measuring, and that and bring your whole team in on the work and write it into your grants. If they're going to ask you to evaluate, then you need to show them there's a cost related to that, and any strong funder will understand that.
Thanks. Amy, close us up.
I really liked the points that were made earlier about just the need for transparency with your clients and your staff about why you're collecting that data. I think that really increases response rate and buy-in in the whole process. So people, even your staff, aren't going like, why am I wasting my time on this? This isn't service delivery. This is what's getting us funded for service delivery. Can I also drop in 2 really boring, but I think very practical resources that we talked about in the report? Was Google Forms is a really free, it's not really free, it's free and really easy to use when it comes to collecting data. I really encourage people, it has built-in translation. And Catch a Fire, volunteer networks. I know organizations that found data analysts, people who had experience with data that wanted to volunteer. So asking for those as volunteers in your organization is another sometimes cost-effective way to get at these kind of resources. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We are going to wrap up. I will say this is my contact information, and if you would like me to direct questions towards any of our panelists, please let me know. And if you go back to the announcement for this webinar, you'll find links to things, including some Tech Goes Home resources, some short results of STEM Alliance evaluations, the guide from Digitunity. And I just want to say thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to my colleague, Reed Sharkey, who's been producing this webinar. All right, and with that, we will say goodbye.
Thank you.